The battle is on to reduce the estimated 320,000 medical errors made in Britain each year. To win that fight, doctors and nurses must first openly admit their mistakes. When they do, it becomes clear that a combination of things, and not simply the actions of a single doctor or nurse, lies at the heart of most medical mistakes. But for patients to benefit, medicine must do more. The caring profession must apply the hard-learned lessons of other hazardous industries. This film is about those attempting to build a better future. In June last year, 8-year-old Ryan Welch went into the George Eliot Hospital in Nuneaton for some tests to try and explain his bedwetting problem.
We never had a dry night off him for quite a few years, and at school he started to want to go to the toilet a lot at school as well, so we knew he'd probably got a little problem.
3 days after his admission to the hospital, Ryan Welch was dead. A series of mistakes following a routine catheterization led to the onset of septicemia, which the hospital did not spot until it was too late.
A simple bedwetting test, that's all he went in for, and he landed up having brainstem death. Just too shocking for words.
Ian and Denise's pain has been made worse by the fact that they have had no explanation of what happened from the hospital.
They've not even contacted us to see how we're coping. Not one of them up there have contacted us.
Over the years since Ryan's death, his parents have tried to arrange a meeting with the hospital.
We're 15 months down the line now, and really it does seem an inordinate length of time for the hospital to actually get around to talking to the parents about the case. Right from the outset, it seems to me that it would have been in their interests to accept the fact that something had gone badly wrong, contact the family, give them the support they were entitled to, and just be completely honest with them about explanations.
I don't think anybody will ever really see how bad Denise has been affected. There's some days that she just cannot deal with it. She's in tears, I find her crying in corners. Little things might spook her. She has flashbacks. She sees Ryan with tubes coming out of him but don't see his face. She has dreams and nightmares in the night, and all this nobody sees, and the hospital has got no idea what we're going through.
All too often, this is the way that the medical profession in Britain leaves its victims. The defensive position adopted by the medical professionals involved exacerbates the feelings of grief and injustice.
We're in the attic of Ryan's grandma's at the moment. All his toys and his clothes had to be brought up here because his mother couldn't bear to look at them. Too many memories that upset her. Never really took much notice when I packed them. Obviously, dear me, he used to take this into the spare room and just fight with it on his own for hours. Obviously, she can't look at these things. She can't go back to the house where we were living. I could understand why. Must bring back so many memories. And she just can't hold him anymore.
Doctors and nurses are human. They will make mistakes. But regaining the public's trust depends on the profession changing the way it deals with these failures.
I think if they'd have come forward when it all happened, offered us an apology and an explanation, and maybe telling us the procedures that they may have done to improve it so it doesn't happen to anybody else. I think Denise could have coped a little bit better if we'd have had that.
Another small boy, another hospital, a different world. The way the Martin Memorial Hospital in Florida dealt with the case of 7-year-old Ben Kolb shows how far the profession has to go in the UK. Ben had been admitted for an ear operation. Within minutes of receiving his anaesthetic, things had started to go wrong. Half an hour into the operation, anaesthetist George McLean was called to the operating room.
The child's vital signs were exceptional in that his heart rate was very high and his blood pressure was very high. And we treated the heart rate and blood pressure. And the child's vital signs returned to normal and everything appeared to be just fine at that point. We decided to continue the surgery, and within about 5 minutes of that period of time, his vital signs began to rapidly deteriorate. This culminated in a cardiac arrest approximately 10 minutes after the initial episode. We got the child resuscitated with stable vital signs, and we sat down to talk to Mrs. Kolb and explained to her that her son had had a problem during surgery and that he was now in a coma, and we didn't know if he would wake up from it.
Donnie Haas is risk manager at Martin Memorial. It is her job to deal with cases in which there are legal issues for the hospital. She came to talk to Ben's mother, and from the start she was completely open.
She didn't understand what had happened, and I told her that we did not either, but that it was my job to look at this and to try to find out what those answers are, and that I would share that information with her.
By now, Ben's father Tim had arrived at the hospital.
You could tell by the looks on everybody's faces that this was very serious. And it was somewhat dreamlike. You're there, but you don't feel like you're entirely there. The following day, it was made perfectly clear by a specialist that he was brain dead, and at that time we offered to donate all his organs.
I went to the funeral viewing, and that was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do, was go up to the coffin with the family. And this little boy looked just like my little boy had looked at that age. This is very hard for me still. Just a beautiful little boy. And explained to the family that how sorry I was what had happened, and how I did not have an idea what had happened, and just how genuinely upset I was and how sympathetic I was.
Donnie Haas's investigation got underway. Ben's problems had seemed to coincide with the injection of a local anesthetic, lidocaine, around his ear. Donnie sent a sample of the drug that had been injected to the labs at the University of Georgia. The sample wasn't big enough to do all the tests required. All the lab could do was tell Donnie what it wasn't. The test should have shown lidocaine. It didn't.
So we knew at that point only that whatever we had given Ben was not what it should have been. That's all we knew.
But the coroner seemed to have already made up his mind what had killed Ben, saying that he had died of natural causes due to a bad reaction to the anesthetic. Such a verdict effectively cleared the hospital of any blame. In some hospitals that might have been the end of the matter, but Donnie Haas knew the coroner was wrong. She pressed on with the investigation. There was more of the drug left in the syringe itself. Donnie sent it for a second analysis. 24 hours later, the lab phoned through the result.
That was probably the most devastating phone call I'd ever received in my career. It was one of those things that you think is impossible, but it happened, and now you knew it happened, and how's the best way to deal with this?
We were having dinner, and Donnie called, and that she said that she had the information back, and she would like to talk to us about it. I believe it was the following day we went down to Fort Lauderdale, and that's when she told us exactly what had happened.
What I recall saying is that there are 2 medications that are used in the procedure that Ben had. What we found by analyzing the syringes was somehow, and we honestly do not know how, those 2 medicines got mixed up, and that we take full responsibility for that as the hospital, and that we are very, very sorry.
My immediate response was, how could such a simple thing cause someone's death? It was a real shock.
When Ben had undergone his operation, there had been 2 drugs involved. One was the local anesthetic for injection around the ear. The second was epinephrine, or adrenaline, and should only have been used to dab on any bleeding areas during the operation. By mistake, Ben had been injected with epinephrine. It gave him a heart attack and killed him.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
Afterwards, the Kolb's lawyers told Ben's father, Tim, that the sort of openness and honesty displayed by the hospital was almost unheard of.
And I'm thinking to myself, why? Why isn't this normal procedure? That really surprised me. But he assured me that this was so unusual that it would be precedent-setting.
From Ben's death to the meeting at which his parents were told the truth, barely a month had passed.
The father stood up and said that, he said, we just really wanted to thank you. We never would have known, and we always would have wondered. And, excuse me, that's a lesson. That's a big lesson. It's important. As hard as it was, it's the only thing that should be done.
I'm reasonably proud of the way we handled it. We could have handled it better. I wish to God that this had never happened. This case has been on my mind now for years. It stays with you, and it resurfaces. Things will set it off. I think it's made me a better physician, and I just hope to God it never happens again, to be involved in something like that.
This is the box of things we saved from the Kolb case. This is the actual box that we sent the items to the University of Georgia in. And this is the actual syringe that was used to inject Ben around his ear, in the 4 quadrants of the ear. And it was this solution that caused the problem.
But how had the mistake been made? When the 2 drugs were placed in the operating area, they were poured into small cups. Though these cups were different, out of their vials the drugs themselves looked identical, making it easy to give the wrong one. A mistake waiting to happen. The hospital didn't blame any of the individuals involved. They knew their procedures were at fault, and they changed them. Drugs are no longer drawn up from open containers, but are taken direct from the bottle. The mistake which killed Ben Kolb could not happen at Martin Memorial today.
Ben was a healthy 7-year-old little boy who had come to our hospital for his 3rd elective ear operation. He had passed...
Since that time, Donny Haas and George McLean have told as many others as they can in the medical profession about their experience. They even came to London recently and addressed the inaugural British Medical Journal Conference on Medical Error in an attempt to spread the word.
It was a very difficult decision to publicly discuss this case, but the Kolbs wanted us to do whatever we could to prevent this from happening to someone else. This is Ben, and his story is told to you in his memory. And I hope that...
Though telling the story of what happened to Ben is always painful for Donny and George, they know it's important. How important? One small girl owes her life to their evangelism.
I received a call one day from a risk manager who had a little girl actually on the operating table in her hospital at that very moment who was having ear surgery. The little girl had a cardiac arrest. The risk manager had heard me speak at a conference and could not remember what had happened. I told her briefly. She hung up the phone, and I never heard anything else for about a month, and she called back to tell me that she had called the operating room and given that information to the staff right there in real time, and they realized they had made the same mistake. Fortunately for this child, the knowledge at that time allowed them to treat that child differently because they knew what had happened, and the child lived. And I just think that's the answer. It's just got to tell you that this is what we have to do in healthcare. We have to be able to take error and hold it up to the light of day and say, look what happened at our institution, and here is why this happened. So that you just don't make Martin Memorial better, you make healthcare better, and you make it safer for all patients. Preserving evidence or getting things done.
The hospital's honesty in investigating the events that led to Ben's death, and then in talking so frankly about them, are held up as an example of how it should be. But sometimes George McLean wonders why their reaction should still be considered remarkable 5 years on.
If you look at how many thousands of mistakes are allegedly made in healthcare, why are we still being held up as an example? Does that mean that the other 60,000 mistakes were covered up and nobody came forward, nobody tried to change anything, nobody did it right? It just amazes me that we're still held up on this, for lack of a better term, some sort of pedestal for having been open, honest, and dealt with this as decent human beings. It scares me to think that if we're exceptional, my God, what is going on out there?
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th.
With some in the medical community stubbornly refusing to lift their eyes above the horizon, many of the best ideas are coming from another world.
Our whole cause is not to affix blame. It's we want to prevent this from ever happening again. That's our job, to make sure it never happens again.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Most medical errors are not the result of the recklessness or the incompetence of an individual doctor or nurse. They're usually the result of a combination of factors in which the action of the medic is simply the last link in the chain. So simply identifying a guilty doctor or nurse is rarely the solution to the problem. Jim Bajan has just returned to medicine from a world where they worked this out long ago.
We're dealing with people, we're not dealing with malevolent human beings. That's not the problem in healthcare. It's the problem of good people trying to do a good job, and great things don't always happen.
After training as an engineer and then a doctor, Jim Bajan joined the American space program, NASA, and spent several years as an astronaut. Bajan is now one of the most influential men in America's growing patient safety movement.
When you go do the flow charting, Post-its are invaluable. If you do it
He's
without
spreading the patient safety gospel among the staff of the Veterans Affairs, or VA hospitals, where he is head of patient safety. 3.5 million US military veterans come through VA hospitals each year.
We're trying now to try to get people out of that fault fixation and realize that people don't come to work to make errors. They don't come to work to hurt a patient. That's the last thing anybody wants to do.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Jim Bajan's model is his old employer, NASA.
Being an astronaut for about 15 years, you know, we had the opportunity to take part in various investigations, the Challenger investigation, for example, and people were there saying, what happened? How do we make it better? Our whole cause is not to affix blame. It's we want to prevent this from ever happening again. That's our job, to make sure it never happens again.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Even after an event as catastrophic as the Challenger crash, the focus of NASA's investigation was preventing a repetition rather than blaming individuals. The key to making medicine safer is to see it as a high-risk industry like spaceflight or aviation. But the traditional view of medicine as a caring profession has enshrined the culture of blame, setting it apart from other high-risk industries. This has robbed medicine of the ability to avoid repeating its own mistakes. To Dr. Don Berwick, a fellow patient safety thinker, there is nothing unusual about the mistakes doctors make beyond their consequences.
Most errors, as they appear in medicine, are just like the errors that human beings know they make in everyday life. The human mind is imperfect. We have trouble with memory. We make mistakes in handling things and in communication. So these aren't special to the medical environment. One example may be this stovetop. The burners are arranged in a rectangular form, but the controls happen to be linear. And my wife and children and I are always, by mistake, turning on the wrong control because there's no natural relationship. Well, the same happens in healthcare. This is just a stove, but if these were controls on a respirator machine, on a young baby, or on a pharmacy dispensing machine, you can see the consequences of error would mount up very, very quickly. We work in a high-hazard environment. There are a lot of events in medicine, a lot of technologies, a lot of handoffs, and humans are not perfect. So errors that are normal in daily life of little consequence can accumulate into disasters in healthcare, and we now have evidence that that happens all too often.
This deadly cocktail of a mundane error and terrible consequences characterizes the vast majority of errors in high-risk industries, medicine included. If the doctors can acquire the humility to see themselves as workers in just another high-risk industry, the sorts of solutions which are taken for granted in those industries suddenly become accessible. Boston-based behavioral psychologist Dr. Robert Simon has flown into Toledo, Ohio on the latest leg of a remarkable patient safety crusade. The ideas of his MedTeams organization demonstrate the effectiveness of borrowing solutions from industry. He's bringing this insight to the emergency department of the Toledo Hospital, where he will spend the day. In the hospital's emergency department, the doctors and nurses go about their work, admitting and patching up patients, referring them to other departments, or sending them home.
Like, bring it back. So they'll bring it back. Amy's coming up.
As Robert Simon monitors their activity, he's watching for areas in which communication might break down.
Yes, you do.
These breakdowns in communication might seem mundane, but they are at the heart of many medical errors.
Hurt all over. Oh. Does it hurt if I just touch your arm here? No. Touch your chest?
No. Just
Does
get
it hurt?
No, just get it up.
The MedTeams approach is borrowed from work Robert Simon did with another high-risk industry.
You're sick, Cyrus. You're sick today. We're going to take care of you, okay?
In the 1980s, US Army helicopters were dropping out of the sky in alarming numbers. Even more alarming, many of these losses were not the result of enemy action or even mechanical failure.
We look back over 5 years of accident reports. So from 1984 to 1989, we looked to see which of the errors were crew coordination errors. In other words, a failure to communicate or coordinate activities that led to a mishap. What we saw was that the Army had lost $292 million and 147 lives due to teamwork failures. Well, this required some remedy.
Sometimes helicopters would be flown into the sides of mountains or into lakes, simply because, though it was plain to all on board what was happening, nobody liked to mention it. Robert Simon put together a training program to maximize helicopter crew coordination and help prevent this sort of accident. Its foundation is a system of formalized communication between crew members, which by the time recruits first get to sit in the flight simulator is already second nature.
Tail wheels locked, parking brake is set. You have the controls.
I have the controls.
Robert Simon encouraged the flight crews to use a system of callbacks. This involved a formal checking and rechecking of instructions and procedures to eliminate the sort of misunderstandings that might lead to disaster.
Power control levers fly.
Systems check.
Systems check.
The effect of Robert Simon's changes was remarkable.
Above 63, match within 3, check. Check.
The Army realized a precipitous drop of Class A accidents to the tune of about 50%. We couldn't put that all to the aircrew coordination training, but it certainly had a significant impact on the reduction in the accident rate.
Robert Simon discovered the same sort of communication failures within medicine that he'd found among the helicopter crews, and often the results were just as catastrophic. At one of the hospitals he's dealt with, he came across the story of the attempted resuscitation of a 1-year-old baby.
The doctor calls for calcium chloride. The nurse turns around and she administers potassium chloride. The potassium chloride it's a lethal injection, and the baby dies. And it costs the hospital more than $2 million to settle that suit.
Some train flight, 1 or 2 VMs.
The same callback system that has served the US military so well might have prevented the death of that baby.
Gearbox oil level?
Check.
Tail pylon?
Check.
Cockpit area?
Check.
And crew and passenger briefing?
Check.
The nurse would have checked the order back with the doctor and put an end to any confusion. In another hospital, a doctor misdiagnosed a case of meningitis in an 18-year-old patient in an episode reminiscent of those pilots who flew their helicopters unchallenged into the sides of mountains.
The physician examines him and discharges him, says, I think you got the flu. If you want, in a couple days, if you're still not feeling well, come on back and we'll take another look at you. Sends him home. A couple days later, this 18-year-old comes back via ambulance to the hospital, and he's very sick. Well, he has meningitis, and within 6 hours of his re-arrival to the hospital, he dies.
When Robert Simon picked apart the event, he found that when the boy first came in, a nurse had suspected meningitis, but said nothing.
She tells us, well, when I told him a couple weeks ago about something I was concerned about, he just jumped down my throat. And he just said, I'm the doctor here, I do the diagnosis, and, just stay out of the way. So she learned her lesson. She doesn't tell this doctor what's on her mind. And for want of that communication, that youngster may well have lost his life.
Robert Simon's template obliges a nurse in this position to speak up, and more importantly, it requires a doctor to listen. His formalized, structured communication system has transformed emergency departments all over the country.
The changes are subtle. You don't see someone metamorphized into a med team's person. It's in some ways a mental state. The actions are subtle, but the behaviors are powerful.
Some hospitals have reported a 90% reduction in clinical errors, a startling result from such an apparently simple idea. One of the reasons that medicine needs to be treated as an industry rather than as a caring profession is that the machinery now available to doctors demands great expertise. In the early 1990s, the emergence of laparoscopic or keyhole surgery caught the imagination of the public and the profession.
It was very obvious, not to me, but to all my surgical colleagues, that this is something that has had a major impact in the patient's well-being, and it's revolutionized some surgical procedures.
But the way keyhole surgery was taken up exposed some patients to new dangers. In a keyhole operation, the surgeon makes tiny incisions through which are inserted the instruments and a miniature camera lens. The surgeon operates watching the pictures on a television monitor.
Okay, head up, please.
In the hands of men like Aradazi from St. Mary's, it was a great advance. It removed the need to cut a patient open. It reduced scarring, pain, and recovery time. But not all surgeons had Darzy's understanding of what the new industrial technology required of them.
There were major differences between laparoscopic or keyhole surgery and the traditional open surgery that we've all been trained to do. And these led to a number of technical errors in the early days due to the lack of training and the familiarity with the procedure and the instrumentation and the equipment used.
General Surgeon David Rosin was in at the start of keyhole surgery in this country. He recognized that this technique was different and used a shoebox of all things to recreate the disorientation often experienced doing laparoscopic surgery.
What we try to do is simulate that by putting grapes and Smarties and things into the shoebox. Have the camera, the telescope poking through with the camera attached, looking at a screen, so we couldn't see what was in the box, or I couldn't see what was in the box, and then poking the instruments through and trying to pick up grapes, peel them, cut them in half. It was all very good technical exercise, simulation, and of course, terribly cheap.
But in their desperation to embrace the way of the future, some surgeons failed to realize that without acquiring new skills, they risked damaging their patients.
People just went at it like a bullet in China, China shop. They went out and said, "Oh gosh, I've done a one-day course, or I've watched such and such, therefore I must do it."
A surgeon new to keyhole techniques once arranged to come and watch David Rosin perform a laparoscopic hernia repair operation.
He didn't arrive, and he phoned me the next day and said, "I'm sorry I didn't get to your operating to watch the laparoscopic hernia repairs. Are you doing any today?" And I said, "No." I said, "But I will be doing some next week." And he said, "Oh, that'd be too late." And I said, "What do you mean it'd be too late?" And he said, "Oh, well, I've got a case booked for tomorrow."
In effect, in the early days of keyhole surgery, some surgeons were practicing on their patients. In no other high-risk industry would such a thing be allowed. But the very public failures of keyhole surgery in the 1990s concentrated the mind of the profession and led to the development of a number of industrial-type training programs. Where pioneers like David Rosin had had to rely on grapes and shoeboxes, anybody starting down the road today has the benefit of the most advanced computer technology.
We are now able to assess surgeons. We are able to identify areas of weakness and improve them. We can identify those very gifted surgeons very early on and process them quicker. So we've used this technology very successfully in training the future surgeon.
The profession insists that the lessons learned from the introduction of keyhole surgery leave them better prepared for future technical advances. But it's not just in keyhole surgery this industrial approach is bearing fruit.
This is Mr. Straw, who's a 57-year-old man, and they're doing a repair of a right inguinal hernia.
It's 10:30 in the morning in an operating theater at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Palo Alto, California. What began as a routine hernia operation on a middle-aged man is quietly developing into a problem. The patient's vital signs are giving the anesthetist cause for concern. She has only moments to work out what has gone wrong. In the operating theater at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Palo Alto, California, a routine hernia repair has developed into a crisis. The patient's vital signs are fluctuating wildly. Suddenly, the anesthetist loses the pulse. Unsure of what to do, the anesthetist calls for help.
Okay, well, this is a patient that had a spinal anesthesia, so he's intubated now.
The crash cart is brought in, and the team battles to get the patient's heart going again. A routine medical procedure has somehow turned into a full-blown emergency.
Okay, I'm clear, you're clear, everyone's clear. 1, 2, 3.
Watching from next door is California anesthetist Dr. David Gaber.
Well, that's a pretty weird rhythm. This is like a real code.
Yeah, really.
Should the worst happen, Gaber has the power to bring the patient back to life by typing an instruction into his computer.
Just do it now.
Because the patient on the operating table is made of plastic, wires, and computer chips. The doctors are all anesthetists, practicing on the simulated patient, reacting to the rapidly changing symptoms that Dr. Gaber and his team throw at them. They take turns to be in charge of the patient's anesthesia requirements.
They feel a pulse.
The technology is modeled on aviation's flight simulators, which have long been central to pilot training.
We don't think you can eliminate error. What we're really striving for is to better enable us to trap errors when they occur, either if we make them or somebody else makes them, and work together so that those errors don't cause a problem for the patient.
No industry has been more aware of the need to trap errors than the space industry. The industry knows that building a safer system depends on knowing where that system is failing, and that depends on a sound reporting system. NASA employees who make mistakes step forward knowing that they will not be blamed and that any information will be put to good use. Former astronaut Jim Bajan is now head of patient safety at the VA hospitals.
Experience is the best teacher. It's also the most expensive. Better to learn from someone else's experience rather than have to learn by your own. And who pays the tuition for our experience, for our education? Primarily the patient, and that's quite tragic. And what we're trying to get people to do is saying by speaking up when there's a problem, one, if you speak up early, maybe you can prevent the problem from really becoming a tragedy. Secondly, if you have had the bad fortune to have one, if you're the only one that learns anything from it, you're not getting maximum utility from the price that's already been paid. That's a sunk cost. It's occurred. You pay that tuition. Why should everybody else learn about it? Why should you keep it a secret?
The reason why medical errors are often kept a secret is simple. In medicine, unlike other high-risk industries, reporting systems have operated in an atmosphere of personal blame.
When I was a new nurse, back in the early 70s, in most places the theory was 3 strikes and you're out. And I knew that if I made 3 medication errors, I could be terminated. The first time I made a medication error, I reported it just like I was supposed to. The next day, I got a short but to the point counseling by my supervisor and was told that I was to go to take training for 4 hours on how to administer medications.
When Connie made a second error, she reported that one as well.
But rather than 4 hours of medication administration class, I got 8 hours. And a good warning to remember that a third error could very well result in termination, depending on the seriousness of the medication error. I made a third mistake. I took care of the patient. We got it all taken care of. But I will tell you that I thought long and hard about doing a third report. And I did not report the third one. And I felt bad for not reporting it. I knew I should have reported it, but I knew I could be fired. And I talked to my colleagues, I talked to other nurses. Well, lo and behold, I was not the only person who had made more than 2 medication errors in my career at that hospital. Nobody reported the third error. And why was that? Because we knew we could be fired.
This approach to medical error is highly dangerous to patient safety. At the Veterans Affairs hospitals, Jim Bajan has presided over what may be the single most important development in the battle to make medicine safer: the introduction of a formal, anonymous, nationwide reporting system. And significantly, in designing this system, Bajan has gone back to his roots. VA doctors and nurses will send their reports not to their bosses, but to a wholly independent body, NASA.
People will report directly to NASA. It doesn't come through the VA, so people do not have to be fearful that a big brother is watching. They're saying, aha, so-and-so reported this, therefore something bad must be going on. They're a bad person. We wouldn't think that, but people can be paranoid with good reason from past experience. So we want to make sure there's no barrier there. So that way we can get reports through this other avenue and see what else we learn.
A similar independent system will be attempted across the UK for the first time this year. But this openness must go further. Traditionally, the fear of expensive legal action has discouraged doctors and hospitals from being honest with patients. But at the VA hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, they have discovered that if a hospital is proactive in dealing with patient victims, an accident need not cost you the earth. When in 1987, Chief of Staff Dr. Steve Kramen appointed an in-house lawyer to help protect the hospital, he was unconsciously adopting the adversarial stance that usually characterizes a hospital's relationship with any patient alleging negligence.
This was a pretty traditional way of thinking about risk management. At the time, we didn't know any better.
But then the hospital got involved in a case which was to change the way it looked at medical error.
We hit on a case that clearly involved negligence, in which patient had died and the patient's family had known nothing about it.
It had appeared that the patient had died of natural causes. When later it was spotted that she'd been killed by a drug overdose, the hospital knew it was to blame.
There were 2 estranged daughters, and we knew they had no way of knowing that they had lost their mother to a medical error. And we really had not thought before that of what we would do in such a case.
We had a meeting about it and decided at that point that we would do the right thing and notify the relatives. And we did that. So they came in with an attorney. I just told them exactly what happened. They were surprised and somewhat shocked. We told them that we accepted full responsibility for it and that they were probably due compensation and that we would help them get it. We felt we were doing the right thing and continued that way for the subsequent 13 years until today. We're still doing it.
The hard part is just saying we made a mistake, and the easy way to do it is get it out. Simply, not carry on about it, just say it. And people appreciate it.
On top of this, Lexington's honesty means they pay out less in compensation than similar hospitals, not more.
In our experience, once you apologize and admit that it really did happen, it's all downhill from there. Patients basically want those two things. Monetary compensation, I think, is a distant third. We've had a few patients here who've even refused monetary compensation once we acknowledged our own responsibility for their mishap.
Remember 8-year-old Ryan Welch, who died last year of septicemia after going into hospital for a simple test. After more than a year of trying to get some answers from the hospital, Ryan's parents, Ian and Denise, have at last been granted a meeting.
We're heading towards the George Eliot Hospital. We've eventually got a meeting with the hospital after losing our 8-year-old son, some 15 months down the line after loads of pestering, loads of telephone calls.
We hope to have an apology. We hope to have questions answered as to why our 8-year-old son died.
But even 15 months later, the meeting is on the hospital's terms.
We've had to submit our own questions so they can have their answers ready.
They've told us that we can't take a solicitor with us because the meeting is an informal meeting.
Though the hospital has agreed compensation, for Ryan's mum and dad, it's not about money.
Somewhere along the line, some good's got to come from this tragedy. We just don't want it to happen to anybody else.
When we first got in there, they straight away apologised. They answered all our questions. Some they couldn't give answers for, and some they weren't aware of until we actually brought them up.
I was very, very surprised. I expected to get no answers whatsoever. But we got in there and they've apologised before we even sat down. And then they've apologised several times during the meeting. And I do think they're really, really sincerely sorry.
I still think now, if we hadn't pushed it, we'd still be waiting for it. I don't think they would have given so easy.
I agree. I don't think it's easy. 15 months is a long time. Why couldn't it have been 15 days? If we'd have had answers quite quickly after his death, it might have helped us, and especially Denise.
As well as apologising, the hospital has stopped doing the procedure that Ryan underwent. But why could this meeting not have taken place sooner? All that's being asked of the medical profession is that they treat others as they would wish to be treated themselves. It's extraordinary how hard this sometimes seems to be. The fact is that each year, an unacceptable number of us are injured or killed by those that should be there to make us well. Now the medical profession has the chance to heal itself, to stop seeing medicine as some mystical vocation and take on board the solutions that other high-risk industries embraced years ago. But our willingness to understand the profession's failures depends in turn on its willingness to be honest and open with us. This requires a revolution in thinking on both sides. Whether we have the imagination to grasp this chance remains to be seen.